Hi, this is Dan Siegel, author of the book Aware and the book Mind and the Developing Mind, and you're listening to The Soul of Life.
Hey everyone, it's Keith Miller. In this episode, I'm doing something a little different today. Going to share a replay of one of my favorite episodes. It's with Dr. Michael Mithoefer, and he's discussing MDMA treatment for PTSD. This is such a timely conversation for all of us, and I just think for me personally, but in our field of mental health and in the health professions. 2 weeks ago, I attended the Horizon Summit on Psychedelics in New York City. And today on The Soul of Life, I'm going to do this throwback episode so you can hear Michael Mithoefer, who is the lead investigator bringing MDMA through phase 3 clinical trials. MDMA is expected to be prescribable by psychiatrists and physicians for PTSD by the end of 2023. And so more on Michael in just a second. So I went to Horizons, this psychedelic summit, health and science summit. Subject's very important to me, and my eyes are so open to this personally and professionally, the power of these tools, the safety of these medicines, and the robust, absolutely robust literature, even though we're still finding out so much, but the results really speak for themselves. When you see the results you get, there's just nothing else like it. Zoloft, Wellbutrin, multiple drugs don't do what a single dose of MDMA can do, or 2 doses can do for treatment-resistant depression, the panoply of mental illness that goes with PTSD, and so many health areas that are barely mentioned because we're all talking about the FDA deregulation for mental health, but things like cluster migraines, things like the comorbidity of mental illness with dementia, chronic pain, of course, end-of-life care, in the pain, the relationship to pain, the relationship to cancer, breathtaking results that are going on and that we're getting from places like the Aquilino Cancer Center here in Rockville, Maryland, and in partnership with Johns Hopkins. So this subject's very important to me, and increasingly it's becoming the topic in our field. As some of you know, I experienced a mental health crisis over the last few years. I've talked about it quite a bit on my show. And as a caregiver in this helping profession, as a therapist, after years of denial and chasing my tail saying, I'm okay, I'm fine, or, trying to find doctors to find some quote unquote medical problem. Anyway, now I'm comfortable. It's a relief, in fact, to say this, that I have suffered. And the course of symptoms that go with that, thankfully, I've been able to find treatment to get remission of those symptoms. But without ketamine, which was approved by FDA in 2018, I don't think I would have the success that I've had. Nor would I have had my eyes open to it in a lot of ways morally because of my own bias. I was a kid that grew up just like so many of you, believing that due to the war on drugs, the rhetoric of, these drugs poke holes in your DNA or scramble your brain, this is your brain on drugs. Well, yeah, that's true of a lot of drugs, actually. They can be extremely dangerous, and even these drugs can be misused. But the side effect profile relative to things like Prozac even is far lower. The safety and the risk is far lower, and the benefit is far higher. One of my guests on The Soul of Life was the comedian Paul Gilmartin. He's the host of a show called The Mental Illness Happy Hour. Great show. Paul talks in a way that I don't think anybody is doing this. It's so amazing. He's great at getting people to open up, not about what they do, but about who they are. And he's so gifted at that because of his own experience. He talks about very taboo things that if you hide, and if these things that happen to him, in his case, like incest and abuse, when you hide those things, when you're in denial about those things, they make you sick, and they make others sick, frankly, as well. So Paul's really gifted with that. I had the privilege of being invited. Paul let me come on to his show when I was out there in Los Angeles. Got to meet Paul, got to record an episode, and I think it's a great episode. We talk about some of these subjects. I'll put that in the notes for you also on this episode. I'll also put in the notes something I really recommend on the topic of psychedelics in general in medicine. Of course, if this subject is new to you, you should know that this subject is not new, right? Just because it may be new to you. The literature is very deep on this. Michael Pollan has been a gift to, I think, all of us in his book, How to Change Your Mind. And his latest book, This Is Your Brain on Plants, I think the name is that. Great resources because, and Pollan just did an episode on Netflix. His book, How to Change Your Mind, has just been a runaway bestseller. What's so helpful about Pollan is that he brings high level of journalism to the subject, which is the story in the case of the research. We've needed to bring a high level of discipline and research because of the past abuses and reputation of abuse with these drugs. So Pollan brings his kind of journalistic skepticism and his credentials covering the nature of food and our relationship to our body. I mean, this is his topic, right? What we put in our body, why the biases we have about what is a drug and what is like the arcane or arbitrary nature of how we define drugs. So Pollan's work is such a great tool to help the general public get introduced to psychedelics. Or my preferred word, I think a lot of us prefer the word, because it doesn't have the cultural baggage of the word psychedelic, is entheogen. And entheogen is a psychoactive substance that induces alterations in perception, mood, consciousness, cognition, or behavior for the purpose of bringing about spiritual development, and is often done in a sacred context. It's been done for thousands of years. These are not party drugs, right? People who don't need MDMA or don't need psilocybin or don't need ketamine, I don't think should be messing around with it. So anyway, entheogens and at some point, Pollan argues because we're all aging at midlife, at some point we do experience the encounter, let's say, with the need to let go, dying. So arguably, Pollan says we do all need these drugs, but at some point later in life, typically, unless you've gone through trauma. So let's just get back to MDMA and the replay interview with Michael Mithoefer that you're about to hear. MDMA is one of these psychoactive substances. It's synthetically made, so it's a molecule that's not found in nature, unlike many other entheogens. MDMA is also what we call an empathogen, like ketamine or psilocybin or the many other entheogens, like even 5-MeO-DMT. We could do that's a whole nother show to do. All of those drugs have this remodeling effect on the brain after the drug is gone out of your system. So unlike many of the other drugs where you're only under the influence, the benefit is perceived only under the influence of the drug. Like, for example, the medicine I take for hypertension. If I stop taking that medicine, my blood pressure goes right up. There's nothing remodeling about that medicine. It's actually structurally providing a support. And Zoloft and Wellbutrin, those are all typical things like, your statins that you take for cholesterol. You stop taking them, symptoms come back. You may even have a rebound because that drug, as we know with serotonin drugs, the sort of now debunked theory of serotonin system cause for depression. You can have this rebound in which you now are dependent on the drug itself because the brain quits making serotonin, ironically. So this is huge. These entheogens or psychedelics remodel the brain after the person is no longer under the influence. This is huge. It's huge. When it comes to the plague of stress disorders, like substance abuse disorders, trauma-induced disorders like PTSD, the brain can have this experience of openness. So when we think about remodeling or plasticity, openness while encountering the states of terror that caused it to become rigid and chaotic and overwhelmed. So openness, the drug creates this plasticity, and then we can learn, the person is able to learn and get into sort of integration mode. Instead of getting frozen in time, instead of getting rigid or chaotic, the brain moves towards integration, flow, and harmony. So it's amazing what these drugs are doing. And when I was at the Psychedelic Horizon Summit in New York, I got a chance to meet someone named Rick Doblin. Many of you know Rick from his many books. He's like the figure in this movement. He's also the founder of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, a close partner with Michael Mithoefer, who you're going to hear about here. Everyone knows Rick Doblin. Everyone even knows Roland Griffiths from Hopkins here in Maryland. Everyone probably knows Bill Richards. There's a lot of sort of names that are the influencers now in this historical 20 or so year movement of getting the FDA on board with first the research over 20 years that has led to this moment in 2018 and now coming with MDMA of the FDA saying, okay, we get it. These are the best things to treat mental illness. But I want to add to that list of names like Rick Doblin. I want you to add Michael Mithoefer to that list. And today I think you'll hear why. You know, this renaissance we're in that's being fast-tracked by the federal regulators is a story about people like Rick, Roland, Bill, and Michael. Everyone kind of knows Rick's story, and Michael's story is sort of similar. You know, Rick was a former enthusiast for psychedelics in the 70s. He saw the public backlash with Nixon and the war on drugs as a huge tragedy, epic tragedy. Good stuff was happening. It got completely trashed and confused because of the abuses that were happening culturally. Rick rolled up his sleeves. He got an MBA from Harvard and over 20 years built this organization, MAPS, that has methodically befriended the FDA and health regulators by speaking their language and building the scientific literature. This is no longer the days of the pharmaceutical companies just handing out LSD like these drug companies did, like candy in the 60s, and saying, hey, see what you can do with this. So this is not what Michael Mithoefer is doing with MDMA. This is not, hey, take this out in the woods or, you know, take this to Burning Man and just have fun. Michael Mithoefer is another Rick Doblin. And I just wanted to highlight Michael's work today and share this replay so you can take note of what Michael's doing with MDMA. MDMA will be prescribable by health clinics by the end of 2023 to treat PTSD. And again, like I said earlier, we expect psilocybin to be legal sometimes in 2024. I know my own clinical work is pivoting like 90 degrees as I form my own organization and reform my practice so that we can deliver legal and safe psychedelics to treat mental health and mental illness. It's an exciting time. I hope you enjoy my interview with Michael. Welcome to the Soul of Life.
There was no definition of the mind that anybody had.
I'm Keith Miller.
That's really weird.
Can we swear on this?
Something you hear at a swing party.
That sounds fun.
We don't treat trauma. We treat the imprint of traumatic experience.
I stood on top of the Olympic podium, very incomplete, not happy, and never ever thinking that I was good enough.
Donald watched his older brother be destroyed that way, so he had to exile all of the sensitive parts of him.
Free soloing is climbing without ropes. Alex was born for climbing.
Cannabis use disorder is real. There's no question about it.
The broccoli growers of America are livid every time they listen to this part of your podcast.
What happens before sex? What happens during sex? What happens after sex?
Compassion is contagious.
We gotta have cake.
Oh my God, I told him bisexual and that's where I gotta be.
He's incredibly successful by just talking shit about people's fried rice.
This is the Soul of Life. Hey, it's Keith Miller. I just want you to know that I've created a bunch of inexpensive and free courses on marriage improvement, mindfulness, and stress reduction. Just head on over to souloflifeshow.com/courses and check out the cool resources there. Again, that's souloflifeshow.com/courses. In this episode of The Soul of Life, I speak with Dr. Michael Mithoefer, the lead investigator that has successfully piloted the first ever study of MDMA, otherwise known as ecstasy, into the third and final stage of FDA approval for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Mithoefer is featured as a lead character in the 2015 book Acid Test by award-winning journalist Tom Shroder, a meticulously researched history of the controversy and unprecedented healing properties associated with psychedelics. The FDA granted Dr. Mithoefer and his colleagues breakthrough status to expedite its application for approval because they're seeing such dramatic results working with veterans tormented by complex PTSD, which is notoriously difficult to treat even with the best and most expensive therapies.
We've had people just, who've had like uncontrollable rage, just have that stop happening after one session.
I talk with Michael about the safety of therapeutically supervised MDMA and how it works in the brain. MDMA is referred to as an empathogen, because it activates our natural ability to be open-hearted, friendly, and collaborative, something that immediately gets switched off when the brain goes into safe mode while experiencing emotional turmoil. Even garden variety stress can do this, like a parent that yells every day or a boss that expects to get perfection but only gives criticism. But for now, Dr. Mithoefer is using particularly egregious forms of trauma, combat experience, as the test use case with the FDA. And unlike many people's idea of all illegal drugs being dangerous or addictive, a full course of MDMA is given in microdoses only 2 to 3 times in about 1 month, accompanied by an all-day psychotherapy session each time, but the patient essentially walks away born again. They report seeing a world not just the way it was before their trauma, but with eyes that are profoundly capable of seeing gratitude, joy, and meaning in life.
People think they're grateful because they're happy. Actually, they're happy because they're grateful.
I don't think I'm the only one wondering, do I have to wait to get complex PTSD to sign up for this? Wider access to these life-changing treatments for less acute suffering indeed might be coming down the line. Just a week ago, the best-selling self-help guru and podcaster Tim Ferriss talked about his experience of sexual abuse in childhood for the first time publicly. And he credits Dr. Mithoefer for what he described as a breakthrough treatment with MDMA, as well as Dr. Richard Schwartz in IFS therapy, someone that I interviewed in episode 4 of the Soul of Life podcast. And by the way, the Tim Ferriss episode that talks about MDMA and IFS is episode number 464 of his show, which I'll put a link to in the notes here at souloflifeshow.com. As a psychiatrist for many decades, Michael describes how all psychoactive medicines that act on the brain function, are merely tools to help free up the brain to do what it knows how to do, heal and function as a whole.
If you get out of the way and be curious and encourage people to be open to what comes, you find the breadth and the depth and the richness and the complexity of each individual's healing process is beyond what we ever could have cooked up with our rational minds as a plan. And it's far more beautiful and far more effective.
Welcome to episode 6. I'm Keith Miller. This is the Soul of Life podcast, and this is MDMA Breakthrough. I'm Keith Miller, and my podcast, The Soul of Life, is here to help you remember who you really are. I'll bring together people who have gotten off their treadmills. I'll have conversations with athletes, musicians, doctors, scientists, healers, and entrepreneurs to discuss the fascinating edges of our knowledge in neurobiology, psychology, and physics. This is The Soul of Life. Dr. Michael Mithoefer is a psychiatrist living in Asheville, North Carolina, with a research office in Charleston, South Carolina. In 2000, he began collaborating with MAPS, that's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, on the first U.S. Phase 2 clinical trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. He and his wife, Annie, have since conducted 2 of the 6 MAPS-sponsored Phase 2 clinical trials testing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, as well as a study providing MDMA-assisted sessions for therapists who have completed the MAPS-sponsored MDMA training therapy program. He's now the Senior Medical Director for Medical Affairs, Training and Supervision at MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. He is a Groff-certified holotropic breathwork facilitator, is trained in EMDR and internal family systems therapy, and has nearly 30 years of experience treating trauma patients. Before going into psychiatry in 1991, Michael practiced emergency medicine for 10 years. He served as medical director of the Charleston County and Georgetown County emergency departments and held clinical faculty positions at the Medical University of South Carolina. He's been board certified in psychiatry, emergency medicine, and internal medicine. Dr. Michael Mithoefer, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Keith. Really good to see you again.
Good to see you again. It's been many years since we trained together down in Asheville, and I understand you're there right now. How's life in Asheville?
Life is, we're very fortunate that it's pretty not too dense population around here, and we're doing okay with the pandemic. We feel really fortunate that we can keep working from home,
right,
through things like the Zoom.
Exactly.
So we're very lucky. The hardest part is not being able to hug the grandchildren.
Yes, yes. It's so great to see you again and hear what you're doing. I've been following your work for many years since we first met. I think we met maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And during that time, I mean, it really seems to me, Michael, that your work, even at that time, was at the forefront as the lead investigator for the FDA approval of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And I've just watched that unfold in chapter after chapter, and especially in the book Acid Test, which we'll talk about, by Tom Shroder, literally in chapter after chapter. Such a great book we'll get to talk about today, which you're featured in numerous chapters there. I want to start right in and ask you about public perception. So we're going to talk a lot about your work in MDMA and what that is. Want to ask you, my experience, Michael, is that public perception and the general public really doesn't understand the distinctions when we talk about psychoactive medicine. They think of some people, generally speaking, kind of have a misunderstanding about what medicine is really, what drugs are, and how they are used. For example, there's all sorts of conversations now about other kinds of what we would call street drugs, I guess. Drugs that are used recreationally. People use marijuana recreationally and now medicinally, increasingly under medical supervision. Psilocybin, magic mushrooms, ketamine is another one. And there's a long history in this country, as the book Acid Test goes into wonderful detail to describe the serpentine relationship that our culture has had with psychoactive medicine. But we're in an era now, I think, where people are really seeing the medical benefit and the safety of these medicines, and they're calling them medicines. So can you tell me about the difference? Can you set us all straight on what's the major distinctions between maybe something you get from your psychiatrist like Zoloft, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, and what you're working with, which is MDMA, also known as ecstasy for people who have used it recreationally?
Yeah, well, I think it's been a very interesting progression in public opinion since we started, from when many people were saying that either you'll never get approval for that, or that's a dangerous and crazy idea. And over the years, as we published more and more rigorous science in well-respected journals, the conversation has shifted a lot. But I think one of the main misperceptions people have is, you alluded to it, thinking of drugs as just the effect of a drug is just solely based on the chemical properties of that drug and what happens in the human body when you take it. It's really underappreciated what a difference it makes. What the set and setting is the term often used, meaning what is the mindset? What is your mindset going into it? And what is this? So what's your purpose for using it? What's your intention? What's your level of willingness to explore the things that come up, and what the setting is? Do you have proper support? Are there people there to support you and encourage staying with experience? And that can just make all the difference, especially with these kinds of compounds that have such a profound psychological effect when you're taking them. Of course, it's true of Zoloft also, but to a lesser degree. No doubt, your understanding of it and the way the prescriber gives it to you and talks to you about it is going to affect the way it works. Right. That's part of it. But then with these medicines, it's even more pronounced because you have a very kind of discrete period of where you're really maybe having a very intense or deep experience, and the set and setting makes a huge difference during that period.
Right. So tell me about MDMA specifically, its action in the brain, or at least how we're beginning to understand its action. I would imagine there's things we just don't know about how it works, like many drugs. we see the results, and that's an important piece of the research, I think. Tell me about how MDMA works in the brain.
Yeah, well, like, I don't think we know how any psychiatric drugs actually work when it comes down to the details. We know quite a lot about what they do in the brain, but not, and we know the result, but not exactly how the result flows from what we know. So there are a lot of gaps, and the same is true with MDMA. We know quite a lot about it. One thing about MDMA is that it's been studied so widely by governments around the world because of the recreational use. So there's a lot of scientific data about it, even though our treatment research is a relatively small part of that. There's a lot of data. So MDMA is what is sometimes called a dirty drug. It doesn't just affect one system. It affects lots of systems in the body and in the brain, especially increasing levels of serotonin and acting on serotonin receptors, but also other neurotransmitters, norepinephrine and dopamine and others, and also causes elevation in hormone levels, oxytocin and prolactin being two of the most interesting ones from a psychological point of view. It has a very complex effect. Our studies, this is all nonprofit research, so we're operating with limited funds. So MAPS and MAPS Public Benefit Corporation are focused mainly on learning, does it work and is it safe? Because that's what the FDA cares about to approve a drug. So that's what our main thrust is. But many other people are studying things about how it might work. And
tell me
there's
about,
a lot of interesting.
Yeah, if I can ask you about the safety part of it, because that really stands out. I think for a lot of people that may be listening to this, I mean, I think the audience would range the wide spectrum. People who have stumbled onto some of these drugs recreationally and have firsthand experience, or just have a culture in their lifestyle and understanding that it's not something to be afraid of. Other people, and I would put myself in this category, even as it relates to medically controlled drugs. I want to use as little as I can. I want to keep things out of my body. And I work with a lot of clients who are similar and have this kind of skepticism about putting things into their body. So the safety of it, when you mention it's a dirty or so-called dirty drug, I want to make sure that's clear for everybody. So for example, I've shared with you my story of how I've been recently treated in remission for depression. I have been taking Zoloft, which is an SSRI, selective serotonin
Please take the time now
inhibitor,
to subscribe to the
which
Soul
my
of
understanding
Life
of it
wherever you're
raises
listening.
the
Give it a
serotonin
thumbs up
levels
or
by
write a
inhibiting
positive
the
review.
reuptake of the normal absorption of that in the brain. Serotonin being one of the essential brain chemicals that help us ascribe pleasure and meaning to things, right? Like have a sense of joy, even, right? So a lot of complex emotions use serotonin, but also, so I'm using a medicine called Remeron, mirtazapine, which is, I think, maybe one of the opposites of MDMA in that it's a very selective. It's an H1 antagonist, histamine, antihistamine antagonist, which pulls out features of, treats features of depression in the body, and causes a physical effect. But doctors like to use those. I think my sense of it is that they almost like a painter has a palette of colors, and they would rather have drugs that are just yellow or red and blue. And we know what the blue does. We kind of know how that's going to affect. The histamine receptor is going to make you a little drowsy if you block that or something. And so you're saying MDMA affects multiple receptor sites in the brain. Is that right?
Yes, and dirty drug, that's really jargon in psychiatry. It's probably not a good term to use because it implies things that I don't mean. It just means it affects multiple systems. And you're right, in general, there are advantages to drugs that you can select levels of different effects independently. So what you're describing, having two different drugs that do different things, might be better than having them combined, because then you have a fixed dose of each. So you get more flexibility that way. However, there's the other side of it is sometimes there's synergy, and there's a lot that isn't known about that. But some people feel that natural remedies have advantages because the different compounds work well together, and that's evolved over time. So that's an interesting question too. I think with one thing about MDMA, that the way we're using it, MDMA, and the same is true of the way people are using psilocybin in those studies and other drugs that you mentioned, is we only give the drug in our studies 3 times in most studies, sometimes twice, and a month apart. So it's a much different situation in that it really, MDMA certainly has side effects and risks, but it's an advantage if you only take a drug 3 times a month apart in terms of those kinds of things. So it's not, I think that mitigates a lot of the problem of the fact that you're affecting a lot of things at the same time, because you don't really need to adjust it over time.
Right. So it's very different, in fact, and it's sort of some of these treatments, I want to just highlight this for ketamine also. Ketamine tends to have at least some of the research is suggesting 1 month kind of latency period where people come back, severe treatment-resistant depression, where people have tried multiple combinations of typical or atypical antidepressants not working, and then they start using ketamine under supervision and come back a month at a time. But the depression people can report goes into remission that afternoon. Mm-hmm. And it hasn't, no drug has been able to touch their depression for in some cases you read about 10 years, 20 years. And when you get a result like that, is that what you're seeing with MDMA? Is it this sort of dramatic, compelling kind of cases, or are there some people that are just like, that was really, it doesn't work?
Very interesting question, Keith. It's different from that in general. One thing that we don't understand fully is, the separation between the direct biochemical effect of the drug and the psychological effect of the process that people experience. Obviously both are happening. At some level, the distinction is a false distinction, but our level of understanding requires us to make that distinction, to sort it out as best we can at this point. So I think what we see with MDMA is sometimes things do shift right away, because what you're describing with ketamine is very dramatic and short-lived in most cases.
They have to keep getting doses regularly with ketamine every month.
And one interesting branch of work that's going on with ketamine is ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. The idea that you use the ketamine to catalyze a psychological process and work with that process. I haven't done that myself, but talking to people who do it and reading reports, it sounds as if that may prolong the effect of the ketamine. If you do that for a while, you may not have to keep getting it every month, is what some reports are suggesting. So it's obviously both. And so we've had, for instance, people have just start sleeping well who have had terrible sleep, people with PTSD who have had many other treatments and failed, just start sleeping through the night. That has happened.
It's got to be life-changing for them, though.
It's life-changing. And we've had people just, who've had like uncontrollable rage, just have that stop happening after one session.
Wow.
And most of the symptoms, and that's not the usual case, and most of the symptoms, even in those cases, people still had a lot of symptoms, and it was a process over time.
Right.
So our observations suggest, with MDMA at least, it has more to, well, who knows what it has more to do with, but there's a very strong effect of the psychological process is what we think.
It accelerates the psychological processes, therapeutic psychological processes, self-organization properties of the mind and the psyche. Why MDMA and why PTSD? Why? I understand why, but I want to hear you speak to why those are, paired in your studies.
Yeah, well, it really, there's a part in acid test when Rick Dalvin and I first met, and I approached him to ask some advice about how we could get some research going. It turned out we were both interested in that. So we were really interested in studying a number of these different compounds for a number of different things. But we chose MDMA for PTSD at the time because it seems particularly well suited just theoretically. We submitted our first application to FDA in October of 2001. So PTSD wasn't very prominent in the consciousness then. The Iraq War wasn't happening. So, but we thought, since there are two things about MDMA, well, here's part of our thinking. Treating PTSD, treating people for the results of trauma, usually involves revisiting the trauma in psychotherapy. And there are kind of two areas of problem that keep that from working. One is that sometimes, quite often, people with PTSD, they start trying to process the trauma. They're so overwhelmed by emotion, by anxiety, that they can't do it. They drop out of treatment.
They're flooded, right?
They're flooded. It's even re-traumatizing, perhaps. So that's one obstacle. Conversely, people with PTSD often also tend to have a lot of emotional numbing, which is a type of self-protection.
Like the opposite of flooding, they're just shut down, walls are up, and they are denying.
Exactly. Yeah, which makes sense. It's a way of avoiding the very painful feelings. So it turns out that in that case, people might be able to talk about their trauma in therapy, but if they're not emotionally engaged, it just doesn't seem to be very helpful.
Yeah.
So there's this idea that others have described, the window of tolerance or the optimal arousal zone, where there's a sweet spot where you're neither flooded and overwhelmed, but you're not emotionally cut off either. And that's what one of the ways MDMA seems to work is give people some time in that optimal arousal zone, or thinking of internal family systems terms. And I've talked to Dick Schwartz a lot about this. I'd say it's people suddenly have access to a tremendous amount of self-energy, and they're able to be unblended from their parts that are involved in the PTSD. So
they get into this curious state. It's sort of the drug accentuates and accelerates something which Dick would say, and many people who study the brain say, is a natural ability we all have to experience this, what Dick calls self, or some people would call meta-awareness, metacognition, kind of, or transcendent states where there's curiosity, compassion tends to show up there, clarity, and there's some organization, but it's a flexible kind of thinking. You're talking about the window of tolerance there, where we see people in that zone in the middle, that sort of flow, where psychologists call flow. They can sort of go wherever they need to go, and they're perfectly tuned to the moment and to the environment. They're taking in what they need to, they're letting go of what they need to let go. So you're saying MDMA somehow allows the brain, I'm imagining the hippocampus, the thalamus, all of those, the gatekeepers of our subconscious, right, and sensory information, allows those gatekeepers to kind of work fluidly and efficiently.
That's a good way of describing it. MDMA causes decreased activity in the amygdala, which is the fear center, and increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is like higher processing. So yeah, and I think I've found IFS to be an incredibly powerful model, and used it a lot when I'm not treating people in private practice anymore because I'm full-time on the research, but I found it very helpful. And we find that people's awareness of parts increases a lot with MDMA. And it's a very useful model to have for supporting people.
Right.
But the other thing is, it's very similar, that non-pathologizing, I would say, you could call it a point of view, but I think I would call it a realization of the truth about people.
Right.
Is what I would call it. And, we basically learned the same principle from Stanislav Grof, who was Dick Schwartz has been an important teacher for us, and Stan Grof, who is a psychiatrist who was one of the early LSD researchers.
Founder of Esalen, am I getting that right?
What?
Founder of Esalen Retreat Center?
Not founder, but he was a scholar in residence there for a time after he left Johns Hopkins. He talks about the inner healing intelligence, which I think is the same idea. Mm-hmm. And the idea that, and this is, we talk to people about this in the preparation for the MDMA sessions. That is our approach. We don't think we have the answer for what you need. We think that if we can support you in accessing your own inner healing intelligence, you'll find out what you need and you'll get what you need. Right. That is our approach.
Yeah. It's so beautiful. It's such when I talk to Dick about this, I think people are, got to hear that message really clearly. What a distinction that is from the medical culture up until this point, Western medical culture, this point in time, where the healing process is not the disease. That's something that comes up. I think it might be Joseph Campbell saying that, or I can't remember the quote from the book, but that's what Dick's work is about with IFS, self-leadership. The healing process is not the disease. In other words, somebody who has schizophrenia, and now maybe not all forms of schizophrenia, as obviously we want to rule out things like organic brain damage or parts of the brain that just aren't working physically for some reason, organic reason. But where somebody is having a schizophrenic delusional reaction, they're not in touch with reality. If I apply what you're saying about how the brain works, and then how MDMA assists the brain, actually helps it just kind of get back to its normal way of moving electricity around and functioning, that's something like a symptom like schizophrenia or a delusion is actually the brain is trying to process and heal itself. And we actually need to respect that and try to help it do that, not try to treat it and numb it. There's a description, I think it's Joseph Campbell, who was a well-known comparative mythology and comparative religious studies scholar, and author. His wife Christina had a child. I think I'm getting this right, but this is in the book Acid Test. And she went into postpartum psychosis, what doctors probably labeled from the DSM postpartum psychosis. She was not in touch with reality. It probably looked very disturbed and acted very erratically. So they gave her a tranquilizer in the emergency or in the medical ward. And so then she was just left with all the fear and terror because of how the doctors were responding out of fear to get rid of this thing that was happening. She called that a spiritual emergency.
That was Christina Grof. That was Stan Grof's wife.
Yes, thank you. Stan Grof's wife. So it sounds like that's parallel to what you're talking about, that we don't want to get rid of these things that are happening. When the mind fragments because of trauma, we want to help explore the fragments and kind of bring acceptance and compassion to those. MDMA accelerates that?
I would say so, yeah. And as you say, there's some areas where it can be not clear. Is there an organic problem where the brain isn't working correctly? And there's a big gray area between those two also. But yeah, I think it stands to reason if, thinking about the analogy.
Hey, I've started a community for Soul of Life fans interested in talking about episodes or getting more information about some of my teaching on IFS, mindfulness, and relationship growth. Head on over to
sometimes information
community.souloflifeshow to get access to this group of really cool people just like you who care about the show
So the response
and want to talk about episodes or hear more, get access to courses and support each other through life. That's what this is all about.
But
please leave an iTunes rating for the show and subscribe now wherever you listen to get more soul in your life.
Never does something that isn't along the lines of an attempt to heal. So why would the psyche be any different?
Yeah, it's just a truly fascinating way, and I'm so delighted to find that there's so many more voices now in the field of psychology and in medicine who are seeing this emergent property of the body and the mind-body as something we don't have to pathologize. We can just we want to go along with it a lot more than a lot of Western medicine does. And don't get me wrong, there's if you have an infection, we don't want to meditate and try to get in touch with the infection more, right? We want to get the hell away from it and get it out of the body.
Right.
But just help the body. We don't need napalm, right, to get rid of an infection. Maybe the most minimal thing. When you mentioned healing and the way the brain works and how it can heal itself, really, if we facilitate it and link it together or help it link together.
You're listening to the Soul of Life podcast with me, Keith Miller. Every week I bring you a new episode that hopefully inspires you to reflect more on who you are and who you want to be in this rapidly changing world. If this time we share together moves you somehow closer to who you are or lights up parts of you that have been unplugged, I want to hear from you. And please share the love. Take a moment to find the Soul of Life podcast in the social media where you hang out on iTunes, Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, and let me know who you are.
Tell me about your journey. You started off, well, if I remember right from reading about this, I had heard about parts of this when I got to know you in training. But you applied for a loan with your wife Annie. You thought maybe you're going to open up a farm with Clydesdales, and you didn't get the loan, and so you said, "Screw it, I'm going to go to medical school."
Yes.
Tell me about your journey to being a healer. You transitioned from an ER doc to psychiatry, especially.
Yeah, well, it's a journey that probably makes me, as one of the interviewers for medical school said, it sounds like you don't have looking at what you've been doing the last few years, it sounds like you don't have your head screwed on straight.
Wow.
So, I was actually an English major in college. I went to college thinking I wanted to go to medical school, and then I took chemistry and realized I really didn't enjoy chemistry, but I loved English literature. I love literature and writing.
I've heard that from many people. They getting stuck at organic chem.
Well, it wasn't even organic. It was just regular chem. I had to go back and take organic later, which I actually enjoyed at that point. Anyway, so I was an English major, and then, I graduated in 1970. We were on strike at the end of my senior year, trying to stop the Vietnam War, and I worked on that, and then I really wasn't thinking I wanted to go to school again, and ended up living in a commune in upstate New York, which is where I ran into Annie, whom I had known just vaguely before, and we've been together ever since. That was 1971, and we've been together since then. So that was the best thing about the commune. It was a lot of fun, but not an obvious path toward medical school. So I had kind of a feeling that I was in a position to do more, to contribute, and that I wanted to do something, get more skills to do something. After a while, I thought, this is great. I wanted to be a writer, and found out that's not as easy as you think it is. Well, you know that.
That's right.
So I decided, I had it in the back of my mind to go to medical school, but I also wanted to do organic farming. So that was I walked out of the federal land loan office or whatever, and said, as you said, screw it, I'm going to go to medical school. So, but I had never taken organic chemistry or physics, unfortunately, or biology, actually. I took physics. So I had to go back and take courses at the University of Vermont is where I did that. And that's when I took organic chemistry, and I actually found it was fascinating. Had a very good teacher there.
Then you went into emergency medicine, Michael. I want to have you read a part of the book Acid Test where you're quoted, because I think it talks about your time. You decided to study emergency medicine, and you worked. You say a little bit about that first, if you can, to set this up. Your work as an ER doctor.
Yeah. Well, when I went to medical school, I actually trained in internal medicine. I initially thought I wanted to be a general internist, but then I found that I really liked the more acute evaluation of things in the ER. It was kind of ironic because my favorite thing was talking to the patients, but I also liked action. So anyway, I ended up doing some extra training in surgery and pediatrics and practicing emergency medicine for 10 years. In those years, there weren't many emergency medicine residencies, so you could take the boards if you had other training. So I found the ER to be very interesting and enjoyable is a funny word for it, but I liked that work for quite a while. But over time, I began to feel like I needed a change, which is something that happens for me periodically throughout my life. So yeah, this is a quote that you've asked me to read from Dick Schwartz, the author of Acid Test, recorded many conversations. So I guess this is from
Tom Shroder. Yeah,
Tom Shroder recorded it. So this must be verbatim what I said. I can't say I remember the precise words, but and I was feeling, this is talking about toward 10 years in the ER and feeling like I needed to change. And I was feeling drawn towards something, a different relationship with patients. I was always doing things to people, which was actually very good sometimes. That's what it called for. Putting a tube in and making somebody breathe, that kind of thing. But I was kind of developing a longing for a more collaborative way of working with people, and also kind of feeling that I was catching the tail end of psychiatric problems. I was seeing people who were having heart attacks because they hadn't been taking care of themselves, or who were stabbing each other, who were taking overdoses. A lot of what happens in the ER is a result of psychological problems coming to an end result. So it also felt like it would be more satisfying to intervene at a different point.
Yeah.
So that's part of what drew me to psychiatry. Also, my own curiosity about the nature of consciousness and psychological process.
Yeah. What really resonates for me when I was having my spiritual emergency over the last 4 to 6 months, and kind of getting in touch with exiles, as I told Dick about this, exiles that were being protected from protectors that were protecting protectors that were hiding those protectors. And as a healer, as a person who chooses the identity of healer, a person who wants to run into, whether even I would even say a firefighter, right, an actual police officer, firefighter, those professions, they're helping professions. We choose to go in to the situation where people need the most help. For some reason, we want to show up there and be there. And so I found myself unwillingly, I would say, but with the help of medication to help my brain go where it just needed to go and really wanted to go, I got in touch with these parts of me, as you point out so eloquently in that quote that you just read, parts of me that were confused about doing and being. And it sounds like you almost had a similar kind of crisis in the ER. I mean, you can do things in the ER. You're putting tubes in, you're recording everything. Everything's charted. It's very nice and clean and linear, I suppose. It's rewarding in that sense. You go home and you either did something or you didn't. Maybe it's like farming in a way. It's very clear. People live or die. Plants live or die. but something rattled me, and it sounds like it rattled you as well. And you said you wanted to do something that was more holistic, or something that allowed you to broaden yourself. Is that a fair assessment?
It is, and not fully realizing how much that was true as I stepped into it, really, because the thing that made me decide on psychiatry largely was reading Stan Grof's work. And I thought his way of understanding these deep psychological processes and the healing potential of non-ordinary states of consciousness, not just with drugs, but with breath work or meditation. I thought that was so compelling that I thought, yeah, this is the direction I want to go. So I applied for psychiatry residency and for the Grof training at the same time. And the Grof training happens in 6-day modules over a couple of years. There's 9 of those. So I was able to do them concurrently. I'd periodically go out to California and do the Grof training. So I got to the Grof training thinking, I had already done quite a lot of my own therapy in the past. And I had had my own psychedelic experiences in college. So I thought, I kind of know this territory, and I'm going to learn to work with other people. And the first thing I learned was the main thing about working with other people is doing your own work, and confronting your own fear and your own parts, and working internally is a prerequisite, really. And I found important to keep doing periodically. In a way, of course, it fits with what we're saying. This non-pathologizing approach, trusting that these are human capabilities to heal these things. We're not going to really be capable of fully trusting that unless we've gone there ourselves. Whatever took us there, whether it's depression or just willingness to heal, or feeling a crisis in your career, or whatever. It really brought home to me. I had many painful and intense, and some joyful and liberating experiences doing my own breath work, which is actually quite a bit like psychedelic sessions. And then I went on to do internal family systems, having my own therapy for a number of years.
Want to put a footnote in there and asterisk, kind of just to connect some dots for people. Holotropic breath work, just to, and I'll give my assessment of it, but you're obviously the expert here. But just to connect in the wider culture, my understanding of it is the hyperventilating practice, or really breathing intensely. Is it super oxygenating the bloodstream, and then that's what's or is it causing the brain to get slightly less oxygen, and that's what causes the altered state?
Well, actually less, yeah. It's increasing the oxygen pressure slightly, but most of the oxygen is carried in the hemoglobin, so you can't get much higher in oxygen, but you can get a lot lower on carbon dioxide. So you're blowing off carbon dioxide is there's really a more important effect, because that causes a shift, which causes the hemoglobin to release less oxygen. So paradoxically, even though there's a little bit more oxygen in the blood, it doesn't get into the tissue as easily. And also there's some vasoconstriction, constriction of blood vessels. So it's actually, that's probably more the effect. But as Stan Grof says, it's like a non-specific releaser. So the way the holotropic breathwork came about was, Stan Grof is really one of the world's leading LSD researchers in what was then Czechoslovakia, and then at Johns Hopkins. And but then when suddenly LSD became illegal, he couldn't do that anymore. But he had realized, and coming as an academic psychiatrist and trained in psychoanalysis and biological psychiatry, when he started seeing what was happening with people with LSD, he realized, the psyche is much bigger than we realized. And so he got curious. Unlike, some people pathologized these powerful experiences, but Stan thought, no, these are actually, they're powerful and strange sometimes, but they have a coherence and a meaning, and they actually can be helpful to people. We need to work with this. So he was a true scientist that decided to pursue it. So he began reading and realized, well, many cultures have known about this phenomenon of having ways to shift consciousness for thousands of years, sometimes through plant medicines, sometimes through breathing practices or prolonged dancing or drumming.
Yeah, religious experience, the mystical. Even I want to just point out, conservative theologies have in their body of knowledge some of the same types of experiences. They're just using different language. An ecstatic religious experience, if we were to do a PET scan or an MRI, we would probably find that going on, this euphoria happening, right?
Yeah, well, that's euphoria or terror.
Terror, pretty closely.
It can be both.
related.
But there was actually a study not too long ago with psilocybin for experienced meditators in Switzerland that showed that the effects can be very similar. And actually, now that you mentioned it, that when right before MDMA became illegal in 1985, Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, was very interested in its potential for therapeutic potential. So he realized this is likely to become illegal the way LSD did. So he sent MDMA around when it was perfectly legal then. He sent it around to a number of influential people and asked them what their opinion was. And one of the people he sent it to was Brother David Steindl-Rast, who, are you familiar with his books?
No, but I think I know where you're going with this. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a Benedictine monk, and he's written a number of wonderful books about gratitude. He says people think they're grateful because they're happy. Actually, they're happy because they're grateful. So that's kind of his key message. But he comes from this, intense Catholic, tradition from the monastery, and so he took the MDMA and he wrote back, and I've actually met him since, and he stands by this. He said, yes, this is a genuine mystical experience. This is the same thing that our practices in the monastery are aimed at achieving.
Wow. That speaks so much to me, and I think I hope it really penetrates for people to realize that this isn't about a culture war type of thing, which I think is the unfortunate legacy of the legislation that happened to move a lot of these drugs to Schedule 1 for good reason, because they as you pointed out, and as the book points out, when they're abused or when these are used not for therapeutic purposes, these are dangerous substances. I mean, ergot poisoning was one of the first ones that the witch trials of the 800s in Europe and the 1600s in Massachusetts were the result of toxicity, right, to neurochemicals. So these are neurochemicals that can be dangerous. But and then back to when you mentioned holotropic breath work, I'm just saying this for fun because I want to reference this, but I don't know if you've ever had these things linked together when somebody says, "Oh, you do holotropic breath work," but as people may realize in either literature or films that they're seeing with BDSM, a little bit of sexual neurobiology here from them. But when people are watching someone have their partner choke them during a sexual act, is that what's happening? Are they? I mean, obviously not homicidal sex scenes, but when in BDSM and kink type of activities, when it's a partner related thing, they're looking for. My understanding is that is actually they've given permission to do that, and it's a thing that they're asking their partner to do to enhance the pleasure by depriving the brain slightly of oxygen, not blacking out, hopefully. But is that, if you ever, I don't know, does anybody ever ask you about that?
No, but I suppose I'm aware of people describing that, and I suppose that it's probably what it is in some way. I don't know the mechanism for that, but yeah.
You got to get some research going on that, Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a sidebar. I mean, it looks disturbing, and I've noticed people kind of think of that or miscategorize that as, oh, it's a homicidal or misogynist act, when in fact, if you listen to conversations in the BDSM community, that's a common type of thing, and there's a biology behind it. It's part of a partnered activity, but I just want to get back to getting back to MDMA. Where is the research right now stand? I thought I remember hearing it was fast tracked because it was the FDA saw the results, and especially because the epidemic of suicides from PTSD or associated with PTSD in the military, they said we've got to just get this available to people. Is that correct? Is that happening?
In essence, yeah. It's basically the FDA has a series of steps in drug development. We're basically doing nonprofit drug development, which is a very unusual thing, but seems to be working. So there's phase 1, there's preclinical work in animals, and then phase 1 trials in healthy volunteers. Then there needs to be a series of phase 2 trials, which is when you use it for treatment of a disorder or problem in relatively small numbers, and see if you can consistently demonstrate safety, that it's safe and can be effective. So that's what those 6 phase 2 trials you discussed that MAPS has sponsored. By the summer of 2017, based on that data, the FDA gave us approval to move into phase 3, which is the final phase before you apply to have a drug approved. And they not only allowed us to move into phase 3, they granted breakthrough therapy designation, which is what you're referring to, which means that you have very promising phase 2 data for a problem that needs, definitely, it could be a major advance in the treatment of a problem for which there isn't adequate treatment. So that's the idea. Is it doesn't mean you still have to do phase 3 successfully.
Sure.
But it's aimed at expediting. It means they have an interest in expediting it through the process as much as possible, increased meetings with them and that kind of thing. So that was very encouraging. And now the rule is you have to have 2 phase 3 trials. So we are just finishing the first one. I think the last visit for the last person may have been this week, or last week or next week. I know it's the last person is finishing up, and then we have to clean the database and do all these things to report to FDA. But we should be able to break the blind, because right now we don't know who got MDMA. Half the people got all the same therapy without MDMA.
It's a double blind.
It's a double blind study. So we expect to break the blind in September. And then we'll know if we have a successful first phase 3 trial. Meanwhile, the second phase 3 trial is screening people as of this week, I think.
Wow.
So it's that one's just starting. So we expect it'll go on for another probably a year, take a year or a little more. And at that point, if those 2 are successful, then we submit an application to get an FDA indication for MDMA as a treatment, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as a treatment for PTSD. And it will be required that people have the training in how to work with it in psychotherapy and have specialized clinics. There will not be, we're almost certain, and we don't, what we're suggesting and what we think the FDA sounds like they will probably agree with is no take-home drugs. You won't be able to go to the pharmacy, but it'll be shipped from the manufacturer to the clinic, and it'll have to be a licensed clinic. A little bit like, the methadone clinic model, where you have to, any competent people could get a license to do it, but they need the proper setup and the proper training.
Let me ask you about the setup and training. I want to ask you how COVID is affecting the rollout of this, if it's interfering with the training and the studies, but also setup and protocol, because I looked into possibly starting or bringing a ketamine-based kind of treatment into our practice, and was looking at other practices that are doing this, and Some of them are big players, people with deep pockets who are just kind of opening up clinics, almost like designer kind of infusion clinics, which are out there for health reasons, and they're not too regulated, is my sense of it. Or they find a way to justify treatments that are not medically necessarily necessary. Are you afraid at all that could happen with MDMA assisted psychotherapy? Does it? Are you confident in and hopeful that it's going to take a course where it's really going to be the rollout of this, when it eventually does become available for psychiatrists to administer in a therapeutic setting, that it will be done close to the protocol, which gets the results you're getting?
Well, we have some concern along those lines. I think one advantage we have is that there are two ways we're hoping to avoid going down that designer clinic route, or more than two ways. But one is the fact that even though this is nonprofit, MDMA can't be patented. It's been off patent since Merck patented in 1914, so it's been off patent for a long time. But there is a thing called data exclusivity, which means if MAPS gets MDMA approved in 2023, anybody can make make their own generic and do their own studies and get approval for their own generic. But no one else can use MAPS data for 5.5 years to make a generic.
I see.
And probably no one's going to bother to do their own studies because they can't patent it. So it's never going to be hugely profitable. Two problems with the profitability. One is you only need to take it a few times, and the other is it can't be patented.
So it really works. So the big drug companies are going to say, let's go for something that people need to use the rest of their life. Let's stick with, I don't know, some other thing, trazodone or something. But no, that's fascinating, but encouraging.
So that'll mean that people have to go through the MAPS training, or some training that MAPS considers equivalent, for therapists to understand the basic principles that we think are important to work with MDMA. Now, we don't want people to have to do exactly what we're doing. We want people to be able to innovate, but we want them to have good training in the basic approach of, the inner healing intelligence. And then, people are planning studies to see how it can be combined with one thing or another, how the therapy could be modified a little bit. That's great. I mean, we did a pilot study with couples where we combined it with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy and that was useful. But I think that's going to give MAPS some control, and the fact that MAPS is not, the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation is what will actually have to sell the MDMA after approval. Mm-hmm. Their mission is public benefit, not maximizing profit.
Yeah, and that seems so important.
Yeah, and the cost of the drug is actually a small part because there's so much therapy involved.
Right.
So one of our concerns is, because even though we think it's very cost effective over time, the upfront cost is higher because you need more therapy sessions in a concentrated form. So we have a whole group working on getting insurance, figuring out how to get insurance reimbursement for it, how to find ways to make it cost effective. So we're very concerned that we want it to be available to people, not just people, available to anybody who needs it.
Yeah. It sounds like it's really being done thoughtfully and well, and I recommend the book Acid Test for anybody who's even mildly interested in this subject. It's fascinating, and you get to hear stories not only of you, Michael, but of Rick Doblin, who's the president or director of MAPS, and also a guy named Nick in the book who's a veteran and who was a machine gunner in the infantry, the Marine infantry, and you get to sort of have firsthand view of his combat experience, which was traumatic, using a machine gun on people and then coming back and like you said, having to process that or hold that somewhere in the body and in the brain and in the psyche. It's just fascinating to watch, and then to watch his experience with the psychedelic-assisted, psychoactive assisted treatment is amazing. Which of the different psychoactive medicines out there being studied for use therapeutically do you think is most likely to be, pose the biggest benefit or come to market soon? I know, I can't remember, I guess it's Janssen Pharmaceuticals recently brought to market its Spravato, which is either nasal administered ketamine or injection, of course, in a clinic. Do you feel like there's any, obviously you've spent most of your time, I think, with MDMA and research and experience. Do you feel like, are you going to branch out into LSD assisted psychotherapy or ketamine or others? I don't know if PCP is even on the list anymore, probably not, but.
Well, I think MAPS is interested in ultimately branching out. Right now, if once we get approval for MDMA, then part of the money that comes into the benefit corporation, that's going to go to research and all other things like that. So there's an interest in branching out into some other medicines. I'll be 74 in October, so I've very busy with MDMA for the foreseeable future. So I'm content with not meeting my initial expectation, which was that I study them all eventually.
Right.
But other people are. And I think, it looks likely in terms of where we are in the drug development process, MDMA is the most likely to be approved first, but psilocybin is close behind. They got breakthrough therapy designation for psilocybin for depression, and they're we're starting trials in Europe. They've been doing trials in Europe already. So I think psilocybin and MDMA are likely to be the first two, and then I think there's interest in ibogaine for opiate addiction. It's a more medically tricky drug, but that's an area that is probably going to be important, and LSD also. And
treatment of alcoholism. I think the list goes. You can just go down the list. You can imagine this being used in not only the U.S. military or any military in which there's combat veterans suffering disproportionately from these horrific, very debilitating, not just for them but for their families and for children. Living in a household with someone with PTSD is a super high risk for children situation. So it seems to have these benefits for families. And then even just thinking about prison, the mental illness epidemic, the way we use prisons instead of mental health treatment, which is a whole nother topic, which I'll hope to get into with others about the justice system, especially what we're seeing now in justice reform and social justice, and being more centered on healing and thinking about us as a whole, as not just a country, but as individuals and families. We, instead of just like you said, treating the guy who's coming in with a gash in his arm and patching him up and sending him out, maybe asking some questions. If we can get more integration across our fields and disciplines, where it's not just up to the social worker to ask those questions. It's, an ER doctor who may be listening to this, you may realize that you're in some way serving as like the way a priest does. It's a spiritual act. You're interacting with people during these crises. And if I'm going to be having Dr. Frederick Min on my show, and he's the oncologist, hematologist who was treating me and really for nothing, actually. His treatment findings were, you're healthy, you don't have cancer, get out of here. And he was giving me vitamin B injections for a little while until he said, take the Zoloft and get out of here. But he told me, specifically, he was somebody who didn't have to take the time to do this. He invested spiritually in me. And I'm going to talk to him about that, Michael, on the show. He's a doctor.
Great. I thought your report was so moving, Keith. I really appreciated your sharing your own experience.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you reading it, and hopefully it's meaningful to others who may have this experience. Our bodies and our minds are the same thing. And I think this idea that you know, and certainly I learned about it firsthand, that I would bifurcate and have this division in my own mind that, oh, these are physical symptoms, this must be me getting older, instead of doing the harder thing, which is looking at why is this happening? Why am I not remembering things? Why am I losing words at age 42? And once I could, sit with somebody like Dr. Min, he really broke through to me, because he wasn't anxious about it. He wasn't going to keep doing tests. In fact, that's what he acted from this place of, I would say, spiritual confidence. Obviously, he's gifted in his profession technically, but he had some spiritual chops there, and just being able to reach across and say the right things to me, to say, stop it. This is it. This is something to look at. This is an opportunity for you. Go into it and don't treat this thing. In other words, it ended up that I did need treatment, but he was saying, stop running away from treatment. Nothing to be afraid of. And in fact, that's been my experience ever since.
Beautiful.
That. Yeah.
He sounds like a true physician, not just a technician.
Exactly. And I hope to have conversations with more of those people like yourself, and like so many that I'm sure. I want to bring those people together and help others understand that those people are out there, and that we don't have to settle for kind of the drive-through treatment that we often get because of managed care. Sometimes we have to go
and deep. I think physicians and therapists are hungry for this. I've sometimes said, I think the patients really need this treatment, but so do the physicians and the therapists.
Absolutely.
And we've had psychiatrists, in our training, we show a lot of video of our sessions, and people get to see in great detail what happens for people. And we've had several psychiatrists in the training just break down crying and say, this is why I went into psychiatry, and I haven't been able to do what I really wanted to do for years. So, anybody paying attention realizes there's so much more to psychological healing than isolating it to, you've got to reprocess your trauma, or you've got to correct these cognitive distortions. Both of those may well be true, but to, limit it to thinking about it's just one of those things. If you get out of the way and be curious and encourage people to be open to what comes, you find the breadth and the depth and the richness and the complexity of each individual's healing process is beyond what we ever could have cooked up with our rational minds as a plan. And it's far more beautiful and far more effective, profound, than just reducing it to some simple concept.
Right. Yeah. The concepts are, they're our friends, right? The knowledge that we have and the tools we use, the technology we have, they're amazing, and they get us somewhere. But at the end of the day, we're just on a ride with this thing, and it's called life, right? And we're lucky if we can just kind of tap into something bigger than us, and then realize, wow, my work is simple today. All I have to do is show up. That's it. I have to really show up today, and that's about it. The rest, all the technical stuff will come. I have a golf coach. We'll end on this note, but I have a golf a pro that I've gone to for coaching, swing coach, and he's got this way about him, and it's sort of a Zen thing. I've never asked him if he's like, I don't know what his philosophies are, but he just kind of, all of his instructions, even though they're technically accurate and right on, he has this quality of delivering them, like almost as if he'll say, like, the ball just wants to go straight, Keith. Just let it go straight. It's funny.
That's great.
Stop trying so hard. Of course, you got to do 10 things to sort of be in the right place at the right time. But, generally speaking, get all the work done, and then shut the hell up, or just, move out of the way, like you said, and lay down and submit and let it go. Really a privilege and a pleasure to talk with you, Michael. And I hope people hear this and share it, and stay tuned to MAPS and also the resources that I'll put on the website. A link to Acid Test by Tom Shroder, fantastic book, and also more ways to find you. Is there anything else you want to say about how people can get in touch with trainings and how that's going on during COVID?
Yeah, well, we've had to make a lot of adjustments, of course. We have a training program going. We're in the process of revamping it and expanding it and training more trainers. But in the meantime, we've now, Annie and I have done 2 trainings online. We're going to do another one that we were going to do in the Netherlands in November, and we're going to do it right here from Asheville. And so it's actually, we were concerned about it, but it's going well. It's not the same as being in person, but we think it's working to do it remotely like this while we have to. So, and one of our big focuses is training more therapists to get ready for post-approval.
Yep.
And so we're going to be expanding the training program a lot. People can apply online. I encourage anybody that's interested to just get the application. And if you go to maps.org, I'm not positive if the application's active right now during this transition period, but if not, it will be. You can also sign up for free MAPS email updates.
Right.
And that'll keep you informed about the training. And
that's what I did.
All of our protocols and our treatment manual and everything is available free of charge on the website. That's one of the beauties of a nonprofit. We share everything, except information about the participants, of course.
Yes, confidential. It's maps.org, MAPS.org. And that's what I did, Michael. I was going to say just briefly that got on the waiting list, at least when I tried maybe 3-4 months ago. At the time, the application was not active, I think, because COVID was hitting. But you can get on the waiting list, and I'm on that. And anybody interested in doing it, I hope to see you at one of these trainings with Michael and others that you're collaborating with. Thank you so much for your time. My best to Annie and your family and everyone you're working with.
I will. Actually, I'd like to add one thing. You mentioned that Rick Dobbin and I and Nick are in the book. Annie's also in the book, Acid Test. Not as much, but I just want to point out what an important part of this research and the therapy she has been too, and also a lot of other women involved. So sometimes the guys get more spotlight, but I just want to appreciate how important Annie and the other women's energy has been.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. It's been really fun to see you again, and I hope it won't be so long next time.
I hope so too. Asheville's a great place. I hope to get down there soon.
Thanks for listening to The Soul of Life. This is Keith Miller. Oh, and don't forget, please leave a thumbs up or a like for this episode wherever you're listening, so that others like you may find the soul of life. I mean, really, it's not every day you get to share the soul of life with someone. Okay, so you can post a comment or question on souloflifeshow.com. I'd love to hear from you, and please subscribe now to get the next episode. I look forward to sharing more of my soul of life with you.
I like it, and it's not harsh to my eardrum.
All right, I will go.
Dancing or drumming, dancing or drumming, dancing or drumming, dancing or